Hamish de Bretton-Gordon is a retired British Army colonel. Also, he was a commanding officer of the NATO and UK chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear reaction troops. Welcome to the program, Colonel Hamish.
Thank you very much for having me.
CIA Director William Burns and head of the British MI6, Richard Moore, said that Ukraine's offensive deep inside Russia had raised lots of questions among the Russian elites about where it's all headed. From your perspective, where this all is heading for the Russian side?
Yes, I think it was a really interesting intervention and unique briefing and conference that the head of the CIA and head of MI6 gave over the weekend. I think before we touch on what they said about the Kursk maneuver, it's important they also said that they believed at the beginning of the war the Russians were very close to using a tactical nuclear weapons, but a lot of work in the shadows, no doubt, by the CIA and MI6 and other intelligence agencies prevented that from happening. And very importantly, I think they said, particularly focused at leaders in the West and in Europe, that the nuclear threat now from Russia was mere saber rattling, and leaders, particularly in mainland Europe, should not concern themselves about that too much, because it is my view, and I think the view of the CIA and MI6 and other organizations, that the Russian threats have really worried some of the European leaders, and that's why they've been slow. So I think really important. Both the spy chiefs, I think, said and believe that the Russians have been really rattled by the Kursk maneuver, and it's given them an awful lot to think about. We discussed last time that I was really surprised that the Russians hadn't managed to counterattack. And only today there are reports of more pontoon bridges over the river being blown, Russian ones. So the ability for them to support their troops there, is minimal. We know that the Russians are trying to get a load of troops to the area to try and counter it. But again, we are well over a month into this now. It is looking more and more likely that Ukraine will be able to hold that area, and it's a very big area. I'm sure we'll come on to what's happening in the Donbass at the moment, but it strikes me that the focus of Moscow is very much looking at Kursk and the strategic implications that it has there. It is essential, I think, and I think this is the message that both the CIA chief and the MI6 chief were saying to leaders, that we make sure that Ukraine does prevail with the Kursk maneuver, because it's the best way of getting Ukraine in a really favorable position that it can negotiate with the Russians. I think they go on to say that the reverberations of the Kursk maneuver, are being felt very strongly in Moscow, particularly amongst the elites in Moscow, who, hitherto have been shielded from the war. But they are now, having to send their own children to the front as conscripts, and are realizing that actually, this can't be just described as a special military operation. It's turning into a military disaster for the Russians. So, there is a lot going on at the moment. But I am with the head of the CIA and MI6 that the Kursk maneuver is a brilliant maneuver, and is really focusing the minds of Putin, and his loyal generals in Moscow. But it's essential that we in the West make sure that Ukraine can get as much advantage as possible out of it.
I would like also to get back to Russia's nuclear threats and these discussions between heads of the US and UK intelligence. Do you really believe that there was a real possibility of Russia using nuclear weapons in 2022, or do you think that Russia could try to demonstrate a sign that it would use nuclear weapons just to undermine the Western support for Ukraine, just to use this as a deception instrument?
Absolutely. I think the Russians, Putin has been quite canny, quite clever with his nuclear threats. It was possible in the early days where, Russia thought that the special military operation would be over in 3 days, and they would have taken Kyiv in a couple of weeks. When that went very badly wrong, and they lost a lot of troops, lost a lot in Chernobyl, they lost a lot of tanks north of Kyiv. When it was all unraveling, I think that's when Putin and his generals were looking at perhaps using a tactical nuclear weapon. Now, it seems clear from what both the spy chiefs are saying is that they very quickly, through various mechanisms and others, directly contacted the Russians to make sure that they knew that that would be absolutely disastrous. But ever since then, as you say, the Russians have been using this as a ploy, really against timid Western leaders in Europe. But I think now, we're well into the third year of this war, and the fact that people like the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and their spokesman Peskov are almost threatening nuclear attack every day, I think even the most worried Western leader has realized that this is saber rattling, it's bluff and bluster. And that was the conclusion of the two spy chiefs. I think what is of concern, and we discussed it briefly last time, and I've written extensively about it in the UK Telegraph and also in the Kyiv Independent, is the use of chemical weapons in the Donbass. Now, at the moment, these chemical weapons are just riot control agents, chloropicrin, which is at the very lower end of the scale. There is, I think, concern. I know that MI6 and CIA didn't mention it, but I think there is concern that the Russians might try and escalate to much more deadly chemical weapons. I'm talking to you today from Salisbury, where the Russians attacked the city with the deadly nerve agent Novichok. Now, that would be an escalation almost to the nuclear scale if they did that. And again, I'm sure that both the security services in the US and the UK are making it very clear to the Russians that that wouldn't be acceptable. But the use of these basic chemical weapons in the Donbass and the areas that are being pressed at the moment is actually helping the Russians and giving them an advantage. And I hope that Western supporters of Ukraine think how they can counter that. And certainly I've asked the British government to give Ukraine military gas masks that would make sure that this use of chemical weapons does not get the advantage that it has done. But it is a concern because nuclear and chemical weapons has a huge psychological impact, much more than its physical. And because Putin has no morals or scruples, he's happy to threaten Ukraine and the West with these weapons on a daily basis. The key thing is that our political leaders realize that these threats are hollow, but also make sure that the Ukraine military have all they need to counter it. And in this case, good respirators, gas masks would help. And I hope the British government will give the Ukraine military that as soon as possible.
Also, former commander of the US Army Europe, General Ben Hodges, said that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin would be removed from his office by Russian oligarchs unless he stops the war in Ukraine. And do you also think so?
I think Putin is rattled. I think he's under a lot of pressure. The oligarchs who sort of keep him in power, these unbelievably wealthy people, I think, they and their families are getting tired of being stuck in Russia. Most of them have villas in the Mediterranean and super yachts and jets. They're used to living the high life, skiing in Zermatt and Samoritz in Europe and living, the life. And a lot of them have been very used to living in London and going to the smartest hotels and restaurants. They haven't been able to do that for nearly 3 years. And I agree with General Hodges, and I agree with MI6 and the CIA that is really beginning to rattle these oligarchs. And I'm not sure how much longer they're going to put up with it. And Putin, I'm sure, is well aware the way that we all tip it over and make sure that they do get rid of him is keeping the pressure up. And I'm sure we're about to speak about it, but with Blinken, Secretary of State from the US, due in London today and tomorrow, hopefully the US and the UK and its European and NATO partners will be working out exactly what to do to make sure that that's the end of Putin. And I know that there are a lot of people who are saying, well, whoever follows Putin will be worse. Well, that might be the case, but Putin has destroyed the Russian army. He's destroyed the Russian economy. So even if somebody worse than Putin takes over, they're not going to threaten the West for a generation, because they will have to rebuild that. And that's why it's so important that the US, the UK and its allies, at this moment, this key moment, push home the advantage for Ukraine, so that we can see a new leader in Russia and the end to this war.
Head of the British MI6, Richard Moore, also said that the Kursk offensive aimed to change the game of this war. Do you feel that this offensive has already changed the game in this war?
Well, I agree with the head of MI6. I think it's finely balanced, and I think we have got to realize that Ukraine military have made the bold move. They have made this possible, but it's not a foregone conclusion. Ukraine needs additional assets. It needs the continued support of the US. It needs for Britain in particular to allow Ukraine to fire long-range Storm Shadow missiles into Russia, to interdict all those aircraft and missiles that are firing into Ukraine cities, hospitals and schools. Now, if Ukraine gets all that, I think it will be the turning point. Kursk was the turning point in the Second World War and the beginning of the end of Hitler. We all hope that Kursk in 2024 will be the beginning of the end, of the current tyrant, Putin, who's threatening not only Ukraine, but also the whole of Europe.
Also, General Syrsky, Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian army, says that the Kursk operation has halted Russian offensive in the Pokrovsk direction. Over the last 6 days, the enemy hasn't advanced a single meter in the Pokrovsk direction. In other words, our strategy is working, General Syrsky said. Do you feel that the Russian plans to capture the city of Pokrovsk are falling apart?
Well, I very much hope so. The general is pretty shrewd. And if he thinks that's the case, then, I would back that up. And the fact that things have ground to a halt is I think, evident to that. Because actually, when you look at the Russian maneuvers there, the challenge that they've got is that most of their soldiers are just conscripts. They have virtually no training. And the casualty rates around the Russians are unbelievably high. And you just can't, with untrained troops, you just can't throw them into the front. Ultimately, they will all be killed and it will grind to a halt. What Ukraine showed in Kursk is actually, if you can maneuver with tanks and aircraft and drones, then you can make rapid progress. And if you can catch the enemy by surprise, you can make rapid progress. Nothing like that is happening in the Donbass. The Russians, just like in the First World War trench warfare, they're just plodding forward. And, I think in military terms, we would say they've reached their culminating point. In other words, they can't go any further because they're running out of men, they're running out of ammunition. And of course, those soldiers, those Russian soldiers, most of them don't want to fight anyway. The only reason they keep going forward is that they've got Chechen soldiers behind them who shoot them if they turn around. So, yeah, I hope the general is right that this is grinding to a halt. There were voices suggesting that perhaps the Kursk maneuver was a mistake. I and thankfully people like General Hodges and the two spy chiefs think otherwise, and I think we're probably right. So, yeah, things are looking positive, and this is the time when we have to absolutely drive home the advantage for Ukraine, so that ultimately, I think everybody in the world, everybody right-minded in the world, wants peace as soon as possible, but peace on Ukraine's terms, not on Russian terms. But that, with Ukraine being a strong position now, is looking more favourable. So let's hope that Ukraine can keep pushing home the advantage in the Donbass and also in Kursk.
General Syrskyi also says that his troops had taken away Russia's ability to maneuver and to deploy reinforcements from the other directions. Also, the amount of artillery shelling as well as the intensity of the Russian offensive have decreased, according to the General Syrskyi. How could these achievements influence Russia's war effort in the short and long-term perspective?
Well, I think in the short-term perspective, absolutely what Ukraine has managed to do is to cut the lines of communications behind their troops. In other words, the roads and the railway lines supporting with ammunition and vehicles, they have been cut, which is absolutely what should be done, and Ukraine has done a great job there. So in the short term, that's why the Russian offensive in the Donbass is running out of steam, because it's running out of everything. And these young, inexperienced Russian conscripts can only fight for so long. In the longer term, this is where we hope will be the undoing of Putin himself. We're already hearing, the nightly TV shows in Moscow where the propagandists and the supporters of the Russian regime, mostly have been very pro-Putin and pro the war. But in the last few weeks, really, after Kursk and now that the offensive in the Donbass has slowed down, are beginning to question, and we haven't heard that before, question whether Putin is doing the right thing. Question, hitherto everybody in Russia thought Putin was a brilliant military strategist. The people who were supporting him up till now are now suggesting that's not the case. And and are suggesting that perhaps things need to change. So I think in the longer term, this stalemate is going to have a profound effect. I think also the deep battle, and the deep battle, I mean, the long range drones that Ukraine has been firing at the power infrastructure in Russia, is having a profound effect as well. Petrol is being rationed in Russia. Russia is supposed to be one of the largest producers of petrol in the world. Now, for the average Russian, that is a massive, massive shock. We know the average Russian is very poor and, can barely afford to feed himself, but at least they had petrol. They don't now have that. So, I think the wheels are beginning to come off, and the tighter that Ukraine can turn the screw, enabled by the US and the UK and the Allies, the better. This is a real opportunity. And I think, there are probably 6 weeks of fighting left before the weather means that, the troops will come to a standstill and make it very difficult for maneuver. We must not also forget that there is the election in the US in about 6 to 8 weeks' time as well, which could have an impact. So it's important that everything is done now to try and make sure that Ukraine can force the issue and force the Russians out of Ukraine.
From your perspective, what are the risks of Western allies forcing Ukraine to any kind of not really favorable negotiations with Russia? I mean, forcing Ukraine to cede some territories to Russia.
Well, I think there are two things to this. The danger that some Western countries are worried about, if they force the issue too much and give Ukraine too much, that might lead to Russian attacking them, and it might lead to a nuclear exchange. I think the briefing over the weekend by the head of the CIA and the head of MI6 hopefully have reassured people. These spy masters never appear in public usually, but to do it, I think, emphasizes how important this is. I think, to get on the other side, to try and ask Ukraine to negotiate before it's in a position and cede land, would be a really short-term perspective. I think none of us forget it was Russia who invaded the Crimea and the Donbass in 2014. It was Russia who invaded from Belarus in February 2022. So they are the aggressors. Illegal occupation of Russian land, they cannot allow to succeed. So, I am hopeful that the Western leaders will absolutely back President Zelensky to the hilt when it comes to negotiation. And with Ukraine on the front foot, Ukraine should be in a really strong position, but we must keep backing them, absolutely as much as we can, because a poor peace will not be a long peace. So if Ukraine is forced to, give up land or whatever, then that probably would only encourage the Russians again. So I think it's important that this is is seen as Ukraine prevailing, seen that Ukraine people and the Ukraine government get the result they want. Because ultimately, as we've discussed before, I think the Russian military is so denuded, so destroyed in this nearly 3 years of conflict that it won't be a threat to the West for a long time. So Western leaders and NATO leaders hopefully will understand that and will not keep that in the back of their thoughts when it comes to negotiating peace with the Russians.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is confident that now is the right time to move forward with a peaceful settlement of this war. From your perspective, do you feel that Ukraine has already reached its the best case position for negotiations, the stronger positions for negotiations with Russia?
Well, I'm an observer from afar, but I would gauge that Ukraine can push further. The Germans, of course, have always been slightly hawkish here, and they are suffering. Their economy is suffering more than most because of this war, not least because of the lack of gas and other power that they're not getting direct from Russia. So I think the Germans or the Chancellor Scholz could help by ensuring that Ukraine gets the Taurus long-range missiles, a bit like the Storm Shadows, so that they can bring this war to a rapid conclusion. I'm not sure that I would agree with the German leader that Ukraine is now in a position. It's getting closer, and it will get closer and be more quick if the Germans bend their back and give Ukraine everything it needs, along with the UK and the US as well, and other NATO leaders.
Don't you think that Western leaders are hesitating to provide Ukraine with this permission to strike deep into the Russian territory with US-made and Western-made weapons, just because they want to leave more space for negotiations with Russia for the peaceful settlement of this war?
Well, I mean, that is certainly an idea. And when it comes to negotiations, you always, want to have things to have an advantage. But I think that allowing Ukraine now to use those weapons into Russia would provide greater advantage than the threat. We shall see. It's of course an option, and I think with all these sort of things, with any military action and strategic political decision making, you need to be agile, you need to have plans, you need to be able to change your plans. But I would have thought at the moment the best use of those missiles that the US, the UK and Germany has given Ukraine is to allow them to use them to their fullest extent, because I think that would bring the Russians to the negotiation table far quicker than the threat of their use.
Also, Western media outlets reported that the Downing Street could be ready to move forward with this permission to strike deep into the Russian territory. However, there were some objections from the United States to make these decisions in a consultative way, to make a unified decision. What are the chances for the UK government to doing it on its own, moving forward with this permission to strike deep into the Russian territory? For example, in case of the dramatic U-turn of the foreign policy of the United States after the US general election?
I think there are two things here. First of all, the view from Washington, 3,000 miles over the Atlantic Ocean, is slightly different from the view of London, which is, geographically and psychologically a lot closer to Ukraine, and a lot closer to conflict with the Russians. It's, although we're hearing that London, government in London would like to give the authority to Ukraine to use these weapons, it is slightly tempered by that. I think also the briefing that we had from the CIA and the MI6 chiefs this weekend was to reinforce what we call the special relationship between the UK and the US. But again, there are slightly different aspirations. And as you say, there is a November election coming up, which could change things. I think the UK, it would appear, could probably give permission on its own to Kyiv to use these long-range missiles. And I think we're all hoping that the reason for Secretary of State Blinken's visit to London today and tomorrow is perhaps to discuss this and perhaps to find out where the common ground is and hopefully allow Ukraine to strike those key targets in Russia, which at the moment it doesn't have the permission to do so.
Do you feel that the United Kingdom and UK government is ready to lead the support for Ukraine in case if, for example, Donald Trump wins elections and refuses to support Ukraine?
Well, I think Britain has always been very forward-leaning in support to Ukraine, and the various prime ministers, particularly Boris Johnson, really got onto this very early on. But here in Europe and in the UK, we're much closer to this than the Americans are. So I would hope that we will do that. We have a new government in the UK that is fairly inexperienced in these matters, but I think here we realise that if Russia is not held in Ukraine, then we'll all be fighting the Russians in Europe, and that's the last thing anybody wants at all, because it is likely if that happened, that would turn into a much wider war, potentially World War III. So I hope that our political leaders in London absolutely understand this and realise that to enable this not to happen, we must enable Ukraine to prevail, and that means giving them everything that we've got, because quite frankly, if there's no good having British tanks and missiles sat in sheds in the UK if they could be used in Ukraine to defeat the Russians, because ultimately we will have to fight as well. And, it would be much better to get the Russians defeated and back to Russia as soon as possible rather than extend this war over the next few years or so across Europe.
And my last question for you, how can you outline the key decisions regarding support for Ukraine, which could be made by the UK government in the next weeks and months? For your perspective, what should be done by the new government?
Well, ultimately, they must underwrite everything that's been given before, and also must plan to give more in future. We've talked a lot about the Storm Shadow missiles and permissions to strike into Russia. That is the most important decision they must make, and let's hope that happens this week so it can go ahead. Yeah, my background, I'd like to see the UK give the Ukraine government, the Ukraine army, the gas mask it needs to prevent the current gas attacks in the Donbass, and also to prevent Russia escalating to even more dangerous chemical weapons. But ultimately, Sir Keir Starmer, our new Prime Minister, needs to get right behind the Kiev government and make sure that they have everything they need to prevail. It's going to be a difficult winter. If not, there are lots of other things sort of focusing the Prime Minister's mind at the moment, which he might find more pressing because of their political stance than, helping Ukraine conduct a war against Russia. But ultimately, if Britain gets its support to Ukraine wrong, everything else that is worrying us at the moment will be horrifically irrelevant because we'll all be at war. So, yeah, I hope the new Prime Minister, and I think he understands the situation, will absolutely continue and develop Britain's support to Ukraine so that Ukraine can prevail as soon as possible.
And what would you like to see from the new UK government in the matter of the UK defense, in the matter of its own defense questions and budgets? What is your take on the what kind of the next steps should be made by the new Prime Minister regarding the defense of the United Kingdom?
Well, that's absolutely key and a really good question. There is now a strategic defence review, very much in light in the war of Ukraine. And I think Britain, like a lot of other NATO countries, have paid lip service to defence since the end of the last Cold War. Now, it is clear that in order to have a credible defence, you need a credible deterrent. And it's clear that Britain and NATO's deterrent has not been credible. Otherwise, the Russians would never have invaded Ukraine in February 2022. So as an individual country, Britain needs to look at what it spends and what its military is and make sure that it is fit for the 21st century. Everybody is learning an awful lot from how Ukraine is conducting the war, not least with drones and other technical activities. And that a lot of these things do not exist in the British Army at the moment. So they need to look at that. And it's absolutely clear that Britain needs to spend more money on defence, a lot more money on defence. Our current 2.2% of GDP is woefully small. It is a concern to people like me. The new government has said they'll spend 2.5% on defence when conditions allow. Well, if the conditions now don't force this spending, I really don't know what is. So the new government must conduct its review as quickly as possible, and they need to not just listen to some of the academics and intellectuals who advise them, but they must get down and dirty and find out what military capability is really needed on today's battlefield. And they need to spend the money required to have, as I say, that credible conventional defense. What is happening? Nobody thought we would have war in Europe, again, after the dreadful wars of the First and the Second World War. But that's exactly what we've got. And a lot of it is because countries like the UK have taken their eye off defence and allowed a tyrant like Putin to develop his military. And he has been developing it massively over the last few years. And we've done nothing about it. So it's a massive wake-up call. And it's something that needs to be sorted out with real urgency.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you for having me, and glory to Ukraine as well.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.